As you all know, the diversity that had traditionally in the United States been one that was sometimes accompanied by tension and conflict between blacks and whites. Now that diversity has been further diversified by the addition of a large number of Hispanics. Now, this part of the country is not as heavily Hispanic as some, but in California or Texas, where in many cases Hispanics outnumber blacks, you have extraordinary levels of tension between those two groups. In high schools in California, every time May 5th comes around, Cinco de Mayo, the big Mexican festival, the rumor gets around that the Mexican students are going to beat up the black students. And you get extraordinary levels of absenteeism because there are so many race riots on those campuses that is a very realistic threat. The Los Angeles School District has special flying teams of riot cops that are on call at any time to go to whatever campus needs them to put down the kind of racial violence and racial rioting that can spring up at any moment. A cafeteria food fight will, in just a few seconds, essentially become a race riot. As some of you may be aware, there are prisons in California and Texas that are in a constant state of lockdown. That means that the prisoners are kept each in their own cells and never let out publicly, because if they were to mix at the chow line or to mix on the playground, the blacks and Hispanics would be at each other's throats. This is the kind of thing that diversity brings to us, and yet people still try to tell us that it's a source of strength. Now, I'd like to speak for a moment on the subject of Mexicans in particular. Mexicans, we have about maybe 35, 36 million Hispanics in the United States. There are now more Hispanics than blacks. Of that number, perhaps 22 million are Mexicans. So Mexicans are in some respects the most prominent addition to this diversity that we are supposed to be celebrating. And now, at the risk of causing some offense, I would suggest that adding large numbers of Mexicans to the population of the United States is in practically every respect about the worst possible choice in terms of what is good for America. First of all, Mexicans on average, Hispanics on average, tend to have considerably higher crime rates, poverty rates, illegitimacy rates, school dropout rates than the majority population in the United States. And I've never quite understood why it is that although we claim to be fighting poverty, we import poor people. We claim to be fighting crime, and yet we import groups that commit violent crimes at 4 or 5 times the average rate. We claim to be fighting disease, and yet we bring in people who have exotic diseases we thought we'd eradicated. None of this makes sense to me, but that is in effect what we're doing. Now, in addition to the fact that on these objective standards, Mexicans are very seldom, they're not on average, a clear and substantial addition, an improvement to the country. Mexicans are the only people in the world who have territorial ambitions on part of the United States. As you know, after the Mexican-American War, we detached a substantial part of Mexico and annexed it to the United States. Now, I don't wish to talk in any detail about that war, but I would just remind you that the Mexicans welcomed that war. They sought it, they wanted it, they expected to win it, and in fact, the military dictator at the time promised that he was going to dictate peace terms from the White House. Well, it didn't work out quite the way he'd expected. The point is, polls will tell you that about 2/3 of Mexicans believe that our border with Mexico is simply illegitimate, and that Mexicans should have the right to cross at any time, for whatever reason, that territory essentially belongs to them. Interestingly enough, Mexican Americans are quite outspoken about what they see as what the future will bring. They feel the demographic wind in their sails. They see their growing numbers, their growing influence, and they're quite bold about saying what they expect will happen in the future. Here is a Professor Jose Angel Gutierrez of the University of Texas. He was explaining this to a Hispanic audience. He says, quote, "We have an aging white America. They're not making babies, they're dying. It's a matter of time. The explosion is in our population. You must believe that you are entitled to govern. And then he switched into Spanish. He says, Se están cagando cabrones de miedo, which means whites are soiling their pants. They're so frightened, except he used a more earthly expression than soiling. He goes on to say, I love it. Now, this same Professor Gutierrez in 2004 at a Latino Civil Rights Summit, he said, quote, we are the future of America. Unlike any prior generation, we now have a critical mass. We're going to Latinize this country. It's pretty straightforward. Now here's Mike Hernandez of the Los Angeles City Council. He's an elected official. He says, once again, he's speaking to a largely Hispanic audience, so they sort of switch in and out of Spanish and English and expect everyone to understand. He starts with, Somos Mexicanos. We are Mexicans, in other words. Mexico, some of us say, is the country this land used to belong to. We are the future. We will lead the Western Hemisphere. Here's Armando Navarro, a professor at the University of California at Riverside. Same kind of thing. He says, time is on our side. As one people, one nation within a nation, as the community that we are, the Chicano-Latino community of this nation, what that means is a transfer of power. It means control. There's a lot of, I will cut out some of these people. It just gets boring after a while. But here's a Univision anchorman. Univision is one of the Spanish language television networks in the country. Jorge Ramos. He says, we are everywhere. There's no occupation or activity in this country that escapes our influence. This century is ours. Then here's many Mexican intellectuals. I mean, the people I've been quoting from now are here in the United States. Most of them have U.S. citizenship. But clearly, they are interested in forwarding the interests of Mexico and Mexicans. Once again, a consequence of diversity. In Mexico, here, this is according to one newspaper report, runs as follows. The Mexican writer Elena Poniatowska affirmed today that Mexico is presently recovering the territories lost in the past to the United States thanks to immigration. It goes on to quote her directly. This phenomenon fills me with jubilation because the Hispanics can have a growing force between Patagonia and Alaska. Now, ordinarily, the Reconquista crowd, that is the reconquest people in Mexico, they would generally be satisfied that what was ceded to the United States after the Mexican-American War. Elena Poniatowska wants it all the way up to Alaska. Now, I would suggest to you that it is a serious stupidity on the part of any nation to admit into its territory large numbers of people from a neighboring country who have designs on that territory. I can think of few things more stupid for a nation to do, especially when at every opportunity they demonstrate that their primary loyalty is not to the United States, but to some other Latin American country. Recently, this was in fact just a few months after the 2001, the September 11 attacks, when many Americans were feeling particularly patriotic. A poll was taken of Mexican-American citizens, mind you, which found that only 30% consider themselves first and foremost American. The rest, 70%, consider themselves first and foremost either Mexicans or Hispanic in some broader category. 70%. Now, I would point out that this whole question of diversity and the strength that diversity is alleged to be is given the lie, no matter what people say, by what they do. When a neighborhood becomes heavily Mexican or black or Haitian or Vietnamese, what does the population that was there before? Generally, we're talking about whites, but it might not necessarily be whites. What do? Do they stick around? Do they think, well, this is diversity. This is going to be wonderful. I'm going to stick around and enjoy the fruits, the incalculable fruits of diversity? No, they clear out. Because they recognize that when a population changes, the whole texture of that neighborhood, that institution changes. When people look around the classroom where their student is the only white person, they don't say, well, this is going to be a marvelous, diverse experience for my child. No, they don't welcome this diversity. They go to private school, or they move to a place where they will find a neighborhood more like the ones they're accustomed to.